Hi, and welcome to Ask the Horse Live. I'm your host, Haley Kerstetter, digital editor at thehorse.com. Research suggests that 54% of horses in the U.S. are overweight or obese, putting them at a higher risk of developing other health problems such as metabolic issues and joint pain. However, horses might become underweight due to gastrointestinal problems such as gastric ulcers or chronic health challenges. Regardless of whether a horse is under or overweight, the underlying cause is usually an imbalance between the supply of energy the horse receives and the energy he expends. Understanding how to monitor your horse's condition and make changes when needed can help maintain a healthy weight. This event is sponsored by Purina Animal Nutrition. To answer your questions, we are joined by two expert panelists, Dr. Patty Graham-Thiers of Emory and Henry University and Dr. Kelly Vineyard with Purina. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Thiers, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. I did a minute ago. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be part of this event. So I grew up in Massachusetts. I had the opportunity to start riding horses and being involved in horses when I was in middle school. So I caught the horse bug at that time and into high school. So then I went on to get my undergrad degree at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and I majored in animal science. As I went through my undergrad career, I got the bug for research and teaching. So then I went on to get my master's degree at the University of Florida, and then continued on to get my PhD at Virginia Tech. In the middle of my PhD, I took a position at Virginia Intermont College in Southwest Virginia, and since then I've been teaching in equine programs at the higher ed levels for 30 years. So I'm currently at Emory Henry University, as you said, and I've been there for about 10 years. My research has always focused on protein and amino acid nutrition. My master's was with growing horses, and since then I've focused on exercising horses mostly. So that's where I am.
Awesome, thank you. And Dr. Vineyard, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yep, sure. So I am a senior equine nutritionist with Purina, and I've actually been here 16 years this month. And so at Purina currently, I'm involved with a lot of different things. So it's always something new every day, but I work on new product research and development. I spend a lot of my energy and time with technical nutrition support for equine veterinarians, and also work closely with our sales teams and do a lot of nutrition training there. Work directly with horse owners also. And not unlike Patty, just like her, I kind of grew up and caught the horse bug early as a kid and rode through, middle school, high school, and I went to Auburn University for my undergrad in animal and dairy sciences. And then also, just like Patty, I received my master's degree in equine nutrition from the University of Florida, and we actually studied under the same professor there, Dr. Ed Ott. And then I stayed at Florida for my PhD. I actually worked under a different professor there and focused my work on feeding fatty acids and looking at their effects on immune function in growing horses and mature horses. And so that's a little bit about my background in nutrition, and I'm also continue to ride today. I'm a dressage rider, and when I have time, and I have a 18-hand Hanoverian horse named Dibadoo, who keeps me busy. So
awesome, thank you. Before we begin answering questions, I want to remind our listeners of the Ask the Horse Live format. We're starting with questions submitted during registration. If you're listening live and would like to submit a question, please do so via the chat window. We'll do our best to get to as many of your questions as possible. If you're listening to the podcast recording of this event and would like to join us live in the future, please visit thehorse.com/askthehorselive to register for notifications. And with that, we're going to jump into our question. So the first one is for you, Dr. Thiers, and it's from Olivia in New Jersey, who asks if you can explain the body condition scoring system and how owners can determine if their horse is at the right weight.
Yeah, so the body condition score system was developed to determine whether your horse's weight is a healthy weight. I always tell my students that a horse's weight is more than a number on a scale. And so with the body condition score system, you're literally evaluating the various fat deposits on your horse's body. The areas of the body that you pay attention to would be just below the crest of the neck, the area behind the withers, the area behind the shoulder blade, along the top of the ribs, along the loin area, sort of working your way into the croup, and then the tail head. And so there's the representation of the system is a scale from 1 to 9. The bottom end of the scale, the 1, is for an emaciated or very, very thin horse. And then, of course, we go to the other end of the scale, a 9, that's an obese or extremely fat horse. So there are descriptors for what the various body parts should look like at the various levels of the scale. There's plenty of rubrics online you can find to see that set up with the neck should look like this if there are 2, it should look like this if there are 5, that sort of thing. If you consider the whole scale, of course, that means that a 5 would be considered an ideal body condition score for a horse. Some activities, I would say eventing, racing, polo, might want their horse to be more of a 4 on the body condition score scale. Those horses will probably do a better job with dissipating heat and that sort of thing during exercise. And then other uses of horses, for example, brood mares, probably want them around a 6 for breeding, going into pregnancy and then lactation. Of course, the hunter people like them a little pleasantly plump, so they probably want to see them a 6 on the scale. As far as how to use the scale to tell if they're a healthy weight or not, if they're going to have a body condition score of a 3 or less, that's probably too thin, and that probably means that they're not getting enough calories every day compared to what they're expending. And then, of course, on the other end, if they're heavier than or higher than a 6 on the body condition score scale, they're too fat, they're too heavy. Being too thin, obviously, it's going to create problems with productivity. They'll lose muscle mass, that sort of thing. Being too heavy on the scale can cause metabolic issues. I think you mentioned it in the intro that they can have issues due to just weight bearing in their joints. Again, the dispensation of heat during exercise will be problematic for them as well. So I think, for example, in the body condition score scale rubric, one of my favorite lines on the body condition score 5, which is considered ideal, is that the ribs are not visually distinguishable but easily felt. I always describe to my students that if your horse is standing still and takes a nice deep breath, you'll actually be able to see a little rib, and that's kind of a really good indicator that they're right there in the middle of the scale where they need to be. I'll just finish up by saying that if you start to see fat on your horse in various parts of their body that's kind of a lumpy fat, that is probably an indicator that they've got some sort of metabolic issue, and you won't see that reflected in the body condition score scale rubric as far as the type of fat, but I would just say lumpy fat might be warranting a little bit further investigation.
Awesome, thank you. Dr. Vineyard, Janice in Ontario asks how she can help her overweight horse lose weight.
Okay, that's kind of a big, broad question, but it's definitely something a lot of us are asking because, as you mentioned in the intro, over 50% of horses are considered to be overweight, according to some recent surveys. So, and I would say even in my experience of going into lots of barns, it may be more than that. So it's a good question to be asking. And, I think first of all, you want to look at, look at your whole ration as a whole, and your ration consists of both your forage and whatever concentrate you're feeding. So let's start with the concentrate. I think that's where most people's heads go. So obviously, if you're feeding, several pounds a day of something, they don't need those extra calories. So for an overweight horse, the first thing would be to move them to a ration balancer. And a ration balancer is traditionally, it's a high protein feed designed to be fed at 1 to 2 pounds per day for an average size horse. So it really only is going to supply protein, vitamins, and minerals, not extra calories. So that's ration balancers are great. They're a very good tool in your toolbox when you're dealing with an overweight horse, because just because a horse is overweight, it doesn't mean they don't need nutrition. They just don't need extra calories. So that ration balancer is still going to supply, essential amino acids, zinc, copper, selenium, things that your forage is not going to contain naturally, or it's not going to likely contain enough to meet their needs. You can get that covered with the ration balancer. And a good example of that from the Purina line is Enrich Plus, but there's a lot of them out there on the market. And so then you move to your forage. And this is actually where you really want to pay the most attention, because this is the most of what your horse is eating in a day. And so an average horse is going to consume anywhere from, free choice, 2 to 3% or even more of their body weight in forage per day. A horse is not going to lose weight if they're on free choice forage. So you're going to have to restrict forage intake in some way. And a good way to start that is to kind of get an idea of what you're feeding now. So weigh all of your hay, and if it's 3% of their body weight, cut it back to 2%. If you're already, around 2% of body weight per day in hay, and you're going to have to also estimate pasture if they're on pasture as well, then you can reduce safely to 1.5% body weight in forage. And typically that will reduce in some weight loss. Occasionally we'll see horses that are very resistant to losing weight, and so you may go down even to 1% body weight in forage, but you don't want to do that unless you've tried 1.5% for a while, because we want to maintain good gut function also. And, another good tool in the toolbox, besides your scale when you're weighing forage, is also having a grazing muzzle on hand. So if they're on pasture, utilizing a grazing muzzle can help slow them down. It reduces their, pasture intake by approximately 30%. That's a good tool in the toolbox. So reduce their concentrate, use a ration balancer, measure out their hay, and then get it down to 1.5 to 2% of body weight per day. And then thirdly, increase exercise. Exercise can definitely be your friend when you're trying to help a horse lose weight, and it doesn't even take that much. Even 30 minutes 3 times a week has been shown to help speed up weight loss in overweight horses. So any way you can increase exercise, even if it's hand walking or lunging or obviously riding, that will help too.
Dr. Thiers, Jane Ann in Missouri wants to know if it's best for an overweight horse to be in a stall eating hay or out on pasture for the majority of the day.
Okay. Well, I'm a big proponent of outside, and that's for more than just nutrition reasons. When they're outside, they're more active. That can help them manage their weight. It can help them if they're a little arthritic, if they have joint problems. Moving around is good for them. It reduces the development of vices. So I really love to have them outside if I can. So it's a matter of what type of pasture you have. You certainly want to avoid really lush pastures during certain times of the year. That was not going to help them lose weight. And so if your pasture option is too rich at the time, you can use a grazing muzzle. If a dry lot situation is an option, that gets them outside, but then you can control the quality of the forage and avoid the lushness or control calorie intake. As far as activity, they'll be much more active if they're outside, which if you're having issues with getting them enough exercise can also help them manage their weight and help them to lose weight. Many years ago, I did a study. I was actually trying to look at fitness, trying to maintain fitness in horses, for example, at the university where the horses are off for the summer. And so I compared horses that had the option to be out in our, what we call the back 40, which is probably about 50 acres, or the horses that couldn't handle that, so they were in smaller paddocks. And we put little GPS units on them and monitored how much they moved. And the horses that were in the 50-acre field moved about 10 miles a day, compared to the ones in the paddocks that only moved about a mile a day. So I'm a big keep them outside if you can, but watch the quality of the pasture and put the muzzle on if need be.
Wow, 10 miles a day. That's fascinating that they can do that. And we, sometimes we don't think about that, but in that small paddock, they're not going to be walking around that much.
No.
That's right.
The GPSs, I don't want to take up too much time, but the GPSs would map out their movements, and the ones in the paddocks just walk the fence line. It was
interesting.
That's super cool. Thank you. Dr. Vineyard, Karen in Michigan wants to know if there's a way to estimate how much grass a horse eats when they are being turned out with a muzzle on.
Oh, the very important question, and it's hard to estimate, and there's a lot of good scientists out there that have tried to answer this question, and I think I just mentioned it in the previous question, but it really is going to depend a little bit on the horse and a little bit on the grass, how lush it is, and the length of the grass, but for the most part, grazing muzzles reduce intake by approximately 30%. So, and Dr. Krishona Martinson out of Minnesota has done a lot of work in this area. So if you take that out a little bit and say a horse is grazing on pasture, say for 12 hours, then you also kind of know like how much grass can they eat in 12 hours without a muzzle. Again, huge variation in that estimate as well. For me, as a rule of thumb, it's going to vary, but let's say 1 to 2 pounds of dry matter per hour is just sort of a very rough estimate. So let's say they're grazing for 12 hours. So they're eating 12, it's a 1,000-pound horse. So he's taking in 12 pounds of dry matter in that 12 hours. If he's wearing a muzzle, 30% less would be 8.4 pounds. That's the quick math for you. Very rough. There's definitely some things that will depend upon that can make that, can vary those estimates a little bit. But 30% is a good rule of thumb for reducing intake.
Dr. Thiers, Jack in Arizona asks what feeding program would be best for a miniature donkey with PPID who is overweight.
Okay, donkeys, they're hardy little creatures, and so they do very well with gaining weight on little, I guess I would say. And so PPID, or what some people call Cushing's, is a results in a metabolic disorder that can cause them to have issues with insulin resistance or insulin dysfunction. So you need to be really careful with the sugar, starch intake. He didn't mention how old the donkey is, if he does anything with the donkey to provide it with some exercise. Certainly exercise would be good for this donkey. And there's some evidence that shows that exercise will reduce the insulin resistance. If depending on what the donkey's doing, I don't think it probably needs any concentrate in its diet. That will help reduce the sugar. If it does need additional calories more than what the forage can provide, I would think about maybe a fat supplement rather than grain. Watch if they're out on pasture, watch if that's really lush. I would avoid alfalfa. And again, if you want them outside for the exercise and the pasture's too lush, then think about a muzzle. The other thing you could also think about is potentially, if the donkey's on hay, is to soak the hay. That kind of can sort of wash out some of the sugar and control it that way, but still get the advantage of the forage and the fiber from that.
Yeah,
Awesome.
can I add something to that too? Because
Sure.
donkeys are definitely hardy little suckers, and they're difficult sometimes to manage. And I have seen some people successfully, and soaking the hay is really good suggestion, and using the sort of less quality hay, and even some people are having success with using more straw, like actually like a straw that you might not feed a horse, and building in 25% of kind of a really kind of lower quality straw type forage. It's more just munching,
Yes.
low calorie, because the donkeys, they can be very difficult to manage. Yeah.
And that's a good point. They can handle the straw, whereas a horse would not.
Yes. You wouldn't want to feed it to a horse, but
Right.
donkeys are evolved with a little bit different, like they're hardier. They're just hardy.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Vineyard, we have a bit of a follow-up to your muzzle question. It's from Alex in our live audience, and Alex wants to know if horses with grazing muzzles can actually eat from a slow feed hay net, or is it impossible because of how the hay is flattened inside of a hay net?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I really no, I don't think they can do a very good job eating hay with a muzzle. So, but if they have a hay net on the hay, great. That's going to slow them down too. So don't do both. They're probably not going to get very much.
Awesome, thank you. Dr. Vineyard, Kimberly in Ohio says that her senior horse with PPID also has respiratory problems and is underweight. How can she help him gain weight without exacerbating his existing health problems?
Yeah, that's rough. Got several things going on at once. And and this horse needs more calories, right? But you also have to pay attention to how those calories are coming in. You don't want to feed dusty hay. That's going to make the respiratory problems worse. You don't want to feed something with like high carbohydrate because that can exacerbate PPID if they're also insulin resistant. So underweight horses, we're going to look that with respiratory problems, a really good option is a higher calorie complete feed. Something with a hay built into the feed. When I say complete feed, that means with hay built in. So something like Equine Senior, another high calorie complete feed in the Purina line is actually Omeline 400. It's a very beet pulpy based feed. And both of those can be used in horses with respiratory issues and also those that, especially in her senior horse, if he has trouble chewing, a pelleted senior feed that can be soaked is really good because that helps with the dentition. So, read the feeding directions and look at your horse's body weight. If she's 1,000 pounds, for a complete feed diet, if she's off all long stem hay to kind of reduce the dust from that hay and you want her on a complete feed diet, she may eat, 1.2, 1.5% of her body weight. So that's 12 to 15 pounds a day of a bagged feed. And you have to keep in mind you're replacing the hay, so it's got to be a larger volume. But that will definitely help them gain weight and get the right calories into her as well. You can use fat supplements; those are great. Either straight oils or 100% fat. And sometimes you run up with some horses that may find that to be a little bit unpalatable. So then there's fat supplements like a pelleted fat supplement like Amplify. It's extruded, so it's really high fat and very palatable. And those are some two really good kind of weight gain supplements. But you need to address the base diet first and then use those supplements on top of when you've got your good base diet kind of in line. With a respiratory horse too, soaking or steaming the hay, if you are feeding long stem hay, that's going to help keep the dust down in your hay. So consider either soaking or steaming your hay, in addition to, feeding the higher calorie complete feeds and fat supplements.
Dr. Thiers, Barbara in Wisconsin wants to know how she can accurately take her horse's weight without a scale. She wants to be sure she is feeding her horse the right amount of forage and ration balancer.
Yeah, so of course, the most accurate way to take a horse's weight is with the use of a scale, but not everyone has the luxury of having one of those in their barn. So there's a couple of ways. There's weight tapes. There's some feed companies or dewormer companies that will give them to you when you buy their product as sort of advertising that you use the weight tape around the heart girth area, the area where you would put the girth for your saddle, and you pull it tight around there and see where the ends meet, and that they've already done the math for you there, and it gives you a weight. Those are not quite as accurate as your horse goes up the body condition score scale. So when they get above, that 5, the weight tape is probably off when all you're using is the heart girth measurement. There's another formula out there that you can Google it if you forget what I'm about to say, but you want to measure the circumference of the horse's heart girth, and then you want to measure the horse's body length from the point of the shoulder to the point of the buttock. And then you would take your heart girth measurement, multiply it by itself again, so heart girth times heart girth, then you multiply by body length. Then that becomes the numerator of your formula, and then you're going to divide it by a certain number depending on how old your horse is or whether your horse is a pony. That doesn't make any sense. Horse is a pony. So if it's an adult horse, you're going to divide that numerator by 330, and then that will tell you your horse's weight in pounds. If it's a yearling, you use a different number in the denominator, you use 301. If it's a weanling, you use 280. And then if it's a pony, you use 299. So if, for example, I had a horse that had a 75-inch heart girth and a 70 inch length to their body, and I did that math, it would tell me that that horse weighed 1,193 pounds. So that's a way to tell the weight. Of course, as I said previously, you want to make sure that you're not just using that number to decide whether your horse is an appropriate weight. You want to also use the body condition score scale.
Can I give a little plug for the adult horse weight calculator on the horse website?
Yes, of course.
I use it a lot, actually. And Patty's, I can't believe you rattled off that equation, Patty. That's really impressive. I can't remember it, but there you go. But yes, the horse has a quite nice little calculator on their website. You just Google adult horse weight calculator and you can plug in, you know, the heart girth and the body length, and it will do the math for you.
Awesome. Dr. Vineyard, Claudia in our live audience wants to know if you can talk more about beet pulp and its uses for maintaining a horse's weight.
Oh, that's a great question. It's something I get asked about a lot, and I see a lot that horse owners, you know, we rightly so love beet pulp. It's a great source of digestible fiber. And so, you know, oftentimes we've learned, oh, if you have a horse that's underweight, let's, you know, try beet pulp. And where that comes from is when you look at the calories per pound of beet pulp, and beet pulp is a great source of fiber. It can serve as a forage kind of alternative, so to speak, so like a hay alternative. It will contain more calories per pound than your typical grass hay. So if you're replacing some grass hay or maybe grass pasture, grass forage in your horse's diet with beet pulp, that absolutely can help with weight gain because you're getting more calories per pound from that beet pulp than you say with like from some average quality grass hay. On the flip side, you have to remember, though, you don't want to substitute beet pulp for, let's say, like a high-fat feed or a high-calorie feed. So, like, for example, Purina Ultium is our highest calorie feed that we make. It's 1,900 calories per pound. You wouldn't want to substitute 1,900 calories per pound in that ration with something that's, you know, 1,100 calories per pound like beet pulp. Because you're actually diluting or decreasing the calories. So beet pulp has a great place when you're using it as a forage alternative or forage replacer for horses that need to gain weight. But I do see the mistake is some people using beet pulp instead of like high fat feeds with very high calories. And they're just sort of, they're slowing the process down because, you know, there's only so many pounds of dry matter per day a horse is going to want to eat. And when they're underweight and you're trying to get the horse to gain weight, you want to maximize the caloric density of that ration. So using beet pulp as a forage replacer is an effective strategy, but don't use it instead of a high calorie feed, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Dr. Vineyard, Kelly in Florida, says that her horse is 40 years old with very poor dentition. What can she do to help him gain weight without putting him at risk for choke or GI problems?
Yeah, wow, 40 years old. Kudos to Kelly in Florida for keeping a horse alive that long. That's really incredible. But I'm sure a horse at this point has worn most of their chewing surface down on their teeth. So number one, don't feed long stem hay. She's probably going to quit that. It's definitely a high risk of choke with that long stemmed hay that if it's getting quid, you know, if the horse is quitting when it eats the hay. So instead of feeding long stem hay, you're going to have to feed a forage replacer. And this is I like to call these horses super seniors. This is the super senior that a complete pelleted feed like Equine Senior is made for. Equine Senior, these complete pelleted feeds, they soak really easy when you add water. And actually, specifically with the Equine Senior feed, we make it with this what we call the easy soak technology that within 5 minutes it makes a mush. And it has to do with the way that we some of the ingredients we put in the pellet and the pelleting process, it just breaks down really easily. And always feed water, always soak these complete feeds when you've got a horse with poor dentition that's at risk for choke. I just said that horse always needs water on their feed if they're at risk for choke. And you have to feed enough of that complete feed. To maintain GI function, they need fiber. So a good quality complete pelleted feed. You know, you can also use some pelleted hay. as long as that will break down when you soak it. You know, some of those alfalfa pellets can be like really hard little BBs sometimes. So you have to watch the pelleted hays for these super seniors because they may not break down quite enough. But feed at least, you know, about 1.2% of their body weight in pelleted feed or more if they need to gain weight to maintain GI function. Always soak it so they don't choke.
Dr. Thiers, Priya in Switzerland, says her horse is overweight but has a history of gastric ulcers, so she knows that increasing his workload could exacerbate this condition. What is the safest way for her to facilitate his weight loss?
Yeah, so if increasing exercise is not an option because of her concern, I certainly, and because she says that this horse is overweight, I would certainly cut the grain in the diet and try to cut it out completely if possible. If the horse, for whatever reason, seems to need more calories than what the forage can provide, I would consider a fat supplement before the grain. The sugar and starch is only going to exacerbate the sort of sour stomach that the horse may get and cause more pain from the ulcers. The horse really should have lots of forage. The more frequently that horse is eating forage and producing saliva, that saliva is going to buffer the acid in the stomach and kind of alleviate some of the irritation to the ulcers and hopefully help them to heal. I'm not generally a fan of recommending alfalfa for overweight horses, but maybe a little inclusion of that if the ulcers are pretty bad, because alfalfa has been shown to sort of help with the balance of the pH in the stomach. It's got a lot of calcium in it. It's kind of like taking some Tums. And so maybe consider that if the forage, grass forage is not working all by itself. There are some supplements on the market as well that are supposed to help buffer and help to control the stomach pH, and those may be options if she's concerned about, you know, her question about not being able to increase the exercise load.
Dr. Vineyard, Jenny in Maryland wants to know how she can manage her horse's weight while he is on stall rest for an extended period of time.
Yeah, this is a really challenging situation. If you've ever had a horse on stall rest, it's stressful on everyone, and especially the horse, but also you as the owner. Normally, you're going to want to take the horse off concentrate. You know, no grain concentrate needed. They don't need extra calories. I do always recommend keeping them on a ration balancer. You know, low feed rate, 1 pound a day to provide their essential nutrients. But that's going to help keep the energy level down without, you know, making sure they're still getting everything they need to heal, because oftentimes they're on stall rest, probably for a soft tissue injury or some other type of injury that's healing. And so you do want to make sure they're getting plenty of good nutrients in their diet to facilitate healing. And so then you're going to look at your forage and use small hull hay nets will slow them down and keep them busy. And I really like on the market now, there's all these different little hay ball toys. There's these like dispensers that they have to roll around that you can actually put the ration balancer in. It might be hard if they're in a stall with, you know, with shavings or with dirt. You don't want them eating up the shavings looking for their pellets, but if you had like a space where you can turn them where it's maybe like a matted floor, that would keep them busy. And then, you know, mostly just manage their forage intake to where it's hard for them to get the hay and they have to work for it. It takes them a little bit longer. You can manage it to 1.5 to 2% of their body weight to make sure they don't gain weight. And then the other thing, you're just going to try to keep them like busy and keep their minds occupied. I always like to recommend, you know, if you can, put the horse in the busy part of the barn so they can like watch what's going on and see, you know, if horses getting tacked up, allow them to hang their head out into the aisle of the barn. That way they get some social interaction when they're on stall rest. But yeah, it's a challenge. And so, you know, maybe use a weight tape too, and put a weight tape on them every couple weeks and monitor the weight gain that way. And if you start to see unwanted weight gain, that's when you need to take another look at your hay and you may have to reduce it a little bit more. but it's a balancing act for sure.
Dr. Thiers, Janice in our live audience wants to know if you can explain the difference between a ration balancer and pelleted feed.
All right, so ration balancer is designed to be fed with hay and make up some of the differences that the hay can provide. I think Dr. Kelly said earlier, it's mainly protein, vitamins, and minerals to balance out what the forage, whether that be hay or pasture, is not really providing that horse. Hay doesn't necessarily grow with the right exact nutrients that the horse needs. A regular pelleted diet is what you would, if you're familiar with sweet feed or grain or concentrate products, it's the same thing. It's just everything has been ground up and made into a pellet. So if you have a sweet feed, that would be oats and corn and barley and soybean meal and molasses. It's just that ground up and made into the whole thing is made into a pellet. So it is designed it needs hay. There's no forage provided to the horse from that. But yet ration balancers are generally much, much higher in protein for that reason, because it's just supposed to balance the forage and what that horse is missing and sort of avoid all the calories that you get from grain or a grain pellet.
Yeah, I would add that's to me the biggest point is what you just said is calories. Ration balancers is just everything but the calories, protein, vitamins, and minerals. And then the concentrate feed, the sweet feeds and the pelleted feeds, the traditional pelleted feeds also bring in extra calories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Dr. Thiers, Michelle in Indiana says her overweight horse is more dominant when eating hay in the paddock with other horses, so he ends up eating more. How can she manage this dynamic to help all of the horses maintain a healthy weight?
Okay, so this is more of a management issue to me, and I'm going to assume that she doesn't have the option to change the horse groups around. If she did, that would be the first thing I would do, is put all the horses together that have sort of the same eating behavior or don't tend to dominate each other. But let's presume that that's not an option. In the same paddock, when you have different pecking orders and one is more dominant than the other, I always recommend to have multiple access points to the food. Don't put the food, let's assume it's flakes of hay down in the paddock, all in the same area where they sort of all eating very close to each other. Spread them out if that's an option. Put them in the four corners of the paddock so that they are separated for a while. If the dominant horse is a very quick eater, then maybe come up with something to keep that horse busy for longer. If it's an option to put a slow feeder out there or even a standard feeder that has the slots, anything to slow that dominant horse down in a different part of the paddock, that would give those other horses more time to consume the feed that they need to get.
Dr. Vineyard, Kathy in Washington asks how horse owners can include grazing time in their horse's daily forage intake calculations.
Yeah, great question. I maybe alluded to this earlier, but kind of to repeat it, number one, it varies. It can vary greatly, but there's been several studies out there that have tried to identify kind of some averages, and we think it's somewhere around, on average, for a 1,000-pound horse, so kind of an average size horse, 1 to 2 pounds of dry matter per hour is a good estimate. Now, again, something kind of interesting, some work that was done out of North Carolina, they found that horses that were limited in grazing kind of learned that, and so in the first 4 hours of they consume faster, so it may be closer to 2 pounds per hour, 2 pounds of dry matter per hour of pasture intake, if they're only allowed like 4 hours a day out on pasture. But the longer that they have turnout, they sort of slow their intake down, and it's more in the range of about an hour, 1 pound of dry matter per hour, which is kind of interesting. So if you have like these horses that are overweight and you're like, oh, I'm just going to turn them out for an hour or two, they're going to chow down, is basically what that research found. And I think if you can observe that too, sometimes the horses will they won't let their head up. So keep that in mind. They can eat quite a bit in a short period of time. It's a good estimate, a very rough estimate is 1 to 2 pounds of dry matter per hour.
Dr. Thiers, Donna in Michigan wants to know how to help a horse rebuild muscle after an extended period of illness.
Yeah, okay. So she didn't say what type of illness, so I'm not sure, if the horse has been off feed for a little bit because of the illness, whatever it may have been, then of course we need to take some time, a few days at least, to get that horse back on their normal ration. If they've lost a significant amount of muscle, then of course, this is right up my alley. One of the biggest things that's going to help promote that is to have really good quality protein in their diet. We might want to pay attention to some of the essential amino acids like lysine, threonine, maybe even methionine. There's many grain products on the market that do supplement those amino acids into their formulas. Not all, but some. So you might want to pay attention to that. I did a study again many years ago looking at supplementing some of these essential amino acids into diets. I was particularly interested in aging horses who are losing muscle mass, and so I compared some younger horses to some aged horses and supplemented them with these amino acids, and they were all mature. They weren't growing still, and it benefited both groups as far in terms of more muscle development from that. So make sure you check your protein quality when you're trying to rebuild muscle. And then you got to get some decent exercise in there. And I'm not just talking about running them around. I'm talking about good exercise that makes them use their bodies, makes them use their top line. That's really going to get you some really good muscle building. So hills, and I'm not talking about mountains, easy hills, working over some poles, that's going to help them. Transitions. So the combination between the protein and that good quality exercise will help them rebuild their muscle.
Dr. Vineyard, Callie in South Carolina asks if changes to a herd in a group of horses on pasture board could lead to weight changes in some of the horses.
So certainly, definitely can do that. I think anytime, herd dynamics can really dictate, who eats first, who eats last. Is one horse getting kind of run around? There's a whole lot of different things that can go on, but absolutely, I think it could, especially at first, before things have kind of settled out and they've established their pecking order. I do like the concept, though, and we kind of alluded to this earlier, of if you've got the ability to separate horses based on their kind of eating behavior, that's a really good strategy when you're managing horses in groups, to try to, keep the low pecking order horses in one pasture and some of the more dominant ones together, or at least not keep really low guys with the high guys, because they may not ever let that horse get up to the hay roll, Another thing I like to do is have a hard keeper pasture and an easy keeper paddock, or and separate them basically based on their body weight. So your hard keepers may get, maybe they get a little more hay, maybe they get more grain and they take longer to eat, where the easy keepers, you can manage their, forage and not feed as much hay potentially. So that's another good strategy when you have herds. And then finally, if you're feeding horses in a group, sometimes it's not always convenient, but it may be necessary to separate some of these horses to feed them, especially if you've got some that are really underweight, or if they're, really low on the totem pole. They're just not going to be able to consume enough feed in the short amount of time to gain weight if they've got other dominant horses chasing them off. And so pulling them out, putting them in a little holding pen, or putting them, in the aisleway, or bringing them in a stall can really help get them what they need.
Dr. Thiers, Cheryl in Maine wants to know how she can balance her horse's gut health with helping him maintain a healthy weight.
Yeah, so in the horse's gut, particularly the hind gut, there is this incredible microbiome that lives back there that allows the horse to benefit from forage digestion, particularly the fiber portion of that. And the microbiome will process that and produce volatile fatty acids, which are used for energy. They'll produce some B vitamins and other good things like that the horse can utilize. So probably the best piece of advice is make sure you're feeding good quality forage. And so when you do that, you get a good combination of different types of fibers, cellulose and hemicellulose. and they ferment at slightly different rates, and you want all of those different rates to be happening in the hindgut so that all of those bugs or microbes are happy back there. You certainly want to avoid high grain diets that would risk having some of that sugar spill into the hindgut, which is only going to make the hindgut environment inhospitable to the bugs and not make them happy, and change the pH. And so really good quality forage. You can tell that just by looking at it. For example, you would want to have the stems to be flexible. You want it to be a good color. You want a decent amount of leaves. I always recommend that for grass forages that they're what I like to call mid-bloom, with a really nice tight seed head at the top of it. And that would be my best piece of advice. You could also maybe, if you wanted to, sort of mix up the fermentation rates, include some beet pulp in there or soy hulls. They sort of ferment at a different rate as well and give you that whole spectrum to keep the microbial population happy.
Dr. Vineyard, Veronica in Missouri wants to know the best ways to exercise a horse that is overweight but already has 24/7 turnout.
Okay, so we learned earlier that horses on 24/7 turnout on very large pastures, 40 to 50 acres, can walk up to 10 miles a day. So I would say, but if they're in a small paddock, like Dr. Patty said, they don't walk around as much. So Veronica didn't mention how large of a turnout area her horse is in. But maybe the first recommendation is turn her out as big a paddock as possible, or biggest pasture, so to get more locomotion and get more walking. And I think horses also walk around more when there's other horses with them in a herd situation. But that may not be an option. So the other thing to think about is just because a horse is on turnout doesn't necessarily mean they are getting that much exercise, especially if it's a small paddock. So you are going to need to look at forced exercise. And forced exercise can be a lot of things. It certainly can be riding, so under saddle, but it also can be hand walking. It can be ponying the horse off another horse, and it can be lunging. It can also be free lunging in a round pen. So a lot of different ways you can do forced exercise to increase, their energy expenditure. But even studies have shown even something as little as 3 days a week at a walk and jog for 15 to 30 minutes a day can increase it can spur on weight loss by up to about a half a pound a day. So, and that's assuming that they're on a controlled calorie diet. Adding that just a little bit of exercise 3 days a week, 15 to 30 minutes a day, can speed up that weight loss. So really think about using forced exercise if you can. And then if they're on 24/7 turnout with a pasture that is lush grass, you're going to definitely need to use a grazing muzzle. Any horse that's overweight that's on 24/7 pasture, just kind of a free-for-all, it's going to be difficult to lose weight if you're not managing forage intake. And so you can do that either with a grazing muzzle or if it's the winter and you're throwing hay when they're out on turnout, have a really good sense of how much hay that they're being fed. Weigh your hay. A scale is your friend. Get something that you can, weigh your flakes of hay so you get a good idea of what you're feeding. I will have to say, if a horse is overweight and they have access to a big round bale, it's very difficult to manage their intake. They do have these kind of hay nets that go over the round bales that can slow their intake down, and that's better than nothing. But if a horse is really and truly needs to lose weight, it's a little bit harder to do when they're on free choice forage. So try to limit that forage and increase force exercise.
Dr. Thiers, Lori in North Carolina asks how to safely help an emaciated horse gain weight.
Yeah, so this is a special situation that you need to really take some care and time with this situation. So the first thing I would say is if you have an emaciated horse, you need to have them evaluated by a vet, have them look at their overall health, make sure there's not any other health conditions, have them check their teeth, get their teeth floated if that needs to be done, do fecal egg count, check their parasite load, get them dewormed, and that also needs to be done slowly if they have a heavy parasite load. But if we just think about the nutrition side of it, this needs to be done fairly slowly. Everyone sees the really, really skinny horse and wants to just throw all this food at them and give them as much as they want, and that's a mistake. If the horse has been emaciated or starved for a significant amount of time, that's created this situation. There's been some changes to their microbiome that needs to come back to normal. There may be some metabolic adjustments that are going on that feeding them too quickly is going to cause some problems. So I think the recommendation is to take about 10 days and feed them very slowly, only about a couple of pounds every few hours for a 1,000-pound horse. They usually use alfalfa because it's really easily digested. It's high in protein and good caloric and calorie content compared to grass. And then build that up over, like I said, about 10 days, I think, until you're feeding them a little bit more per meal, and then you reduce the number of meals. It's pretty labor intensive. You're supposed to do it every few hours to give them a couple of pounds. And so as you increase the number of pounds, you can reduce the number of feedings. And then after that 10-day window, if they seem to be responding and doing okay, then you can try to get them onto a more, I guess, normal diet that you want them to be on. Maybe mix the alfalfa with some grass, hay, and then maybe include some grain there. And so if they have significant teeth problems that you've discovered, you'll want to maybe incorporate some alfalfa cubes, soak it, make it easier to chew so that they can get the calories and the nutrition from that.
Dr. Vineyard, Tricia in Alberta wants to know if it's safe to add a fat supplement to a weanling's diet if they are underweight.
So of course I would have more questions for Tricia before I would answer for her specific situation, but the short answer is it's safe, would be yes, it's safe. Maybe the longer answer, in my opinion, is it optimal? And the answer is probably not. And let me kind of explain why. So if we're talking about a weanling, so a 6 to 12-month-old horse, they're in a pretty fast growth rate at this point. I mean, they're growing pretty quickly. They're gaining, up to a couple pounds a day, even depending on the breed. So there's a lot going on in their body, and they need a very specific kind of what I call, or what we would call, the nutrient to calorie ratio. So there is a certain number of calories that will drive growth rate, but those calories have to be balanced with the right nutrients for good skeletal growth and good, soft tissue growth. So bones, calcium and phosphorus. You've got trace minerals that are really important for proper skeletal growth and skeletal health. So if you just throw a bunch of fat into a fast-growing horse's ration, you run the risk of putting in too many calories without balancing with additional nutrients like calcium and phosphorus to sort of support, if you're going to increase the growth rate through those calories, that fast growing bone needs more nutrients, needs more kind of building blocks. So I would recommend, if I had an underweight weanling, I first want to take just a look at their ration. What's their hay look like? If they're eating grass hay, I might switch them over to alfalfa hay. Alfalfa hay is more calorie dense. It's got a higher protein. These growing horses can definitely use that. And most importantly, I mean, it's just more calorie dense. So that will get more calories into them from the forage side and keeps their gut happy. And then we definitely need to have some concentrate in their diet to supply all those essential nutrients that they're not getting in the hay. So you might want to use a high calorie or high fat growth feed. So kind of a little tip for that: when you're out looking for a commercial feed for a weanling horse, for a growing horse, make sure it says in the feeding directions, it's designed for a growing horse. There's a lot of feeds out on the market that are for mature horses. So you don't want to feed a mature horse feed to a weanling because it may not have enough lysine, or it may not have enough copper that is going to meet a growing horse's needs, because they are formulated a little bit differently. So look for a higher calorie growth feed to supplement your forage program and help them, and just feed, increase the amount if you need to help them gain weight. But say you've kind of maxed out and you feel like you're topped out on the most concentrate and hay you're comfortable feeding, then that's where a fat supplement comes in and will add caloric density. You know you're covered in the nutrient category because you're feeding adequate concentrate. So that's kind of the complicated answer to that. Is it safe? Yes. Is it optimal? No, probably look to your hay and concentrate first.
Dr. Thiers, Iris in Manitoba asks how owners can prevent their horses from getting a hay belly, especially during the winter.
Yeah, okay. So first thing that comes to mind, and I'm going to presume that this is not the issue, is sometimes horses get the distended belly when they have a heavy parasite load. So I would first make sure that that's not the issue and evaluate that. The other thing that comes to mind when I think about a horse with a hay belly is that they have a lot of forage that's in their hindgut that's causing their hindgut to get distended. And so that could be a couple of things. They're either being overfed the forage more than what they need, and that's causing the distension, or they might be feeding poor quality forages that are spending a lot of time in the hindgut. Like I mentioned earlier, you want something that's going to be fermented at a decent rate. And so poor quality forage that's really high in that cellulose spends a lot more time in the hindgut and can give them that distended look. The other thing that I would mention is that sometimes when the top line is not well developed, that gives the horse the look that they have a hay belly. And so things like aging, brood mares that have multiple pregnancies and the back ligaments have gotten stretched out, then that sort of is conducive to this look of developing a hay belly. So good exercise that strengthens the top line can help that. I mentioned earlier a little bit of hill work, poles, transitions, but then of course make sure that your forage is really good quality so that it's going through the digestive tract at the right rate and fermenting appropriately, and then don't overfeed them to make sure that they don't have, literally maybe putting on some fat that's exacerbating the distension of the hindgut and giving them that look of a hay belly.
Dr. Vineyard, we're coming to the end of our time tonight, so this will probably be our last question, and it's from Karen in Texas, who wants to know how she can tell if her stock type mare is overweight or just stocky.
Oh, well, that's a good question. If she's asking, she probably already knows the answer because these stock type mares do tend to be easier keepers. But that's where your body condition score system comes in that Dr. Patty described at the beginning of the podcast. And the body condition scoring system is a measure of fatness. I mean, you are looking at these different areas of their body, and you're measuring fat, not muscle. So if they're stock type muscle, no, we're not looking at muscle. We're looking at where the fat deposits are. And if Karen's not comfortable with the body condition score system, she can always ask her veterinarian to help her and to give her their assessment of the horse's body condition. We're looking for that horse to be between a 4 and a 6. If she's a 7, she's overweight. So let's, involve your vet if you're not comfortable with the system, but there's a lot of good resources online where you can kind of learn, familiarize yourself with the system at least.
Well, that's all the time we have for tonight. We've covered a lot, and I hope our listeners have learned as much as I have. Thank you, Dr. Thiers and Vineyard, for joining me.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
And thank you to Purina Animal Nutrition for sponsoring this event. And finally, thank you to our audience for listening and sending in these questions. If you're listening to us after the live event as a podcast episode, please rate, review, subscribe, and recommend Ask the Horse Live to a friend. Until next time, from everyone at the Horse, have a great night.